Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening and good morning, I'm sure to some. Thank you for tuning into this discussion around the intersection of trade, sustainability, and value chains. My name is Andrew Schmidt. I'm with the Secretariat of the 10-Year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production, more familiar known as the One Planet Network, based at the UN Environment Program. I'm just going to take 30 seconds here at the top to go over a few logistical aspects before handing it off to our moderator. You'll note that you're all muted by default. We're going to be using a tool that some of you are probably familiar with called Mentimeter for the questions and comments that you have, because we want this to be as interactive as possible. So to do that, we usually don't ask participants to use their cell phones, but I'm going to ask you to take out your cell phone if you like, and you can point your camera at the QR code that you see on the screen. You'll be able to use that to make any questions and comments. Even if you don't have anything to say, you'll see that you can also vote for those questions or comments that you would like to see answered. And then our moderator will be collecting those and get to them. If for some reason the QR code doesn't work, I'm just right now pasting in a couple other ways that you can access the Mentimeter tool into the chat box. So please join us in there. I think that is about it from my side, besides letting you know that the webinar is being recorded and that we'll be able to send that recording and the presentations to everyone afterwards. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Adriana Nelligan, who will be moderating the webinar today and facilitating the discussions. Dr. Nelligan is a senior economist for green economy and resource economics at the German Economics Institute. So thank you so much, Dr. Nelligan, for being with us today, and I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, also good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all colleagues all over the world. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar called What's Behind the Deal? Innovative Trade Tools to Increase the Sustainability and Transparency of Global Value Chains. As Andrew just said, I'm a senior economist at the German Economic Institute, and I'm particularly happy to moderate this event today because I'm also concerned with sustainability aspects in global value chains in my recent research. What's the background about this webinar? Well, last month, the One Planet Network held a webinar introducing the value chain approach, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the different stages of global value chains and focusing more precisely on how decisions taken at central stages of the food value chain can have important impacts on both production and consumption. Andrew is going to put a link in the chat to the report which the One Planet Network and International Resource Panel recently released on the value chain approach. So what are we going to do today? The One Planet webinar series turns this month to a crucial topic when discussing any global value chains, which is trade. Trade is inherently and inextricably linked to the operation of global value chains, but the incentives built into trade agreements do not necessarily favor sustainable outcomes. So we've got 4 experts here today, and our panel of experts will take us through a series of presentations to look more closely at the role of trade in fostering or hindering sustainable outcomes, and to present a series of tools being used by international organizations and civil society to increase transparency and sustainability along global value chains. So what we hope is that the interventions today provide you with a better sense of the dynamics behind trade, value chains, and sustainability at a number of different levels. So what we'll do is now we'll start off by setting the scene with a global picture of the shifting trade landscape over the past several decades, followed by some examples of overarching and innovative trade tools being employed today. And we'll finish up with a concrete example of how some of these various tools are being used on the ground. So we're really delighted to have some representatives from, 4 representatives from the German Economic Institute, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, the International Trade Center, and the Rainforest Alliance. We want to do the following. First, the 4 speakers shall get the chance to deliver their interventions. After this, I'd like to open the floor to the audience. Questions will be collected, as mentioned by Andrew, via Mentimeter during the interventions. So if you haven't done so already, could I ask the participants to use their phone on the QR code you see on the screen to access the Mentimeter, or the link which is also available in the chat. Before we start the first presentation, we'd like to open the interventions with an icebreaker poll question that you can all answer. And Galina Kolev, our first speaker, is going to answer these questions then. So the question is, what share of global carbon emissions are due to trade-related international trade? You've got 4 options to answer. Is it more than 30%? Is it between 20 to 30%? Is it between 10 to 20%? Or is it less than 10%? Galina, who is going to be our first speaker, Galina Kolev, is a senior economist and my colleague at the German Economic Institute, and she's also the head of the research group Macroeconomic Analysis and Business Cycles at our institute. She'll kick off things by setting the stage on the current trade landscape and what the increasing consolidation of global value chains in recent decades has meant in terms of environmental impacts such as greenhouse gas emissions. So you'll get the answer from her in a couple of slides, I guess. So it's over to you.
Thank you, Adriana. Thanks to all of you for being here to discuss this topic with us, because I think that trade and trade policy have a great potential to pursue climate-related issues. So I think that it is very important to think about what instruments, actually, what measures, what concrete measures a trade policy can apply in order to support climate protection, because this is a global issue, and it requires global solutions, and more global than international trade and trade policy. Well, I think that we all can recognize the very important role trade and trade policy can play in this regard. Before I answer the question and I reveal the correct answer, if it is actually really possible to give a correct answer, I would like to share with you a few thoughts on how the global trade landscape has changed in recent years. I would like to present a few facts to you, especially regarding the role of international trade. You can just remember this picture that you just saw of the results of the Mentimeter, that only a few of you have given the response of below 10%, and most of the participants who gave a response to this survey gave a response of above 10%. So what role does actually trade play today in our consumption structure, in our economic activity? We can take a look at this first slide on the role of international trade. You can please go to the next slide, where we can recognize that trade is important indeed, but about 80% of what we buy, about 80% of what we consume, and it is not only goods, but it is most of its services actually, is not really directly related to trade. About 80% of our expenditure at the end relate to domestically produced goods and services, and about 20% are related to international trade. And concerning international trade, there are these major types of trade. First of all, we have the traditional trade, where we buy bananas and sell tomatoes, for example. This is motivated by a resource endowment of different countries, or by productivity advantages, as in the textbook for international economics. But there is a bigger share of international trade that it's not that simple, just exchanging one good for another. This larger share of international trade concerns the global value chains, and those global value chains, they can be simple global value chains when we import one product or one intermediate product and we use it for the production of another one, or they can be a complex process which involves several steps of production, and those several steps of production take place all over the world. So most of the goods that are traded internationally are involved in those global value chains. So I think that it is very important to think about the role of the global value chains in the context of sustainability and climate-related issues. When we turn back to the major players in global trade, on the next slide, we see how those major players have changed since the establishment of the World Trade Organization in the year 1995. Back then, about 2/3 of international trade took place within or were driven by the developed economies. Today, about half of international trade is driven by developing and emerging economies. And I think that China, or not only I think, but the data show that China is responsible for a very big share of this development. But there are also other countries that are very much involved in international trade. Every country today trades goods with other countries. And when we concern the increase of the trade amount since 1995, then we see that international trade has increased about 4 times, or almost 4 times, since the creation of the WTO. So trade has intensified very much, and we can see or recognize the role that emerging economies and developing economies are or already play on the international scene. And this is, of course, also very important for the relationship between international trade and climate. So I come back to the question at the beginning. On the next slide, we actually see the answer of this question, as the OECD has published a number stating that about 7% of global CO2 emissions are due to transport related to international trade. So 7% is the answer, below 10%. And I think that the numbers presented at the beginning can explain at least a big share of this number being so low compared to the estimations that you gave at the beginning, because international trade is, of course, very important. But the biggest share, 80% of what we buy, takes place or is produced domestically. However, 7% is not a small number, and it is important to stress that it only covers the transport-related emissions coming from international trade. There are also other channels that relate trade to climate or to CO2 emissions. And there is also a second important not only number, but also research by a colleague in the United States who analyzed the impact or the connection between trade policy and climate. And he shows in his research that there is this substantial environmental bias of trade policy, meaning that especially products that are very carbon intensive in their production have rather low tariff rates, meaning that the current establishment of international trade is subsidizing actually CO2 emissions. So we can think in the next step, on the next slide, about the connection between international trade and CO2 emissions, because this is not a very, it is a rather a complex channel that we can analyze in few steps, considering first of all those transport related emissions that we already mentioned. This is the so-called scale effect that connects international trade with CO2 emissions. But beyond that effect, there are also other channels between international trade and CO2 emissions. For example, the technology effect, because without international trade, it won't be possible for developing countries to get to new climate-friendly, environmental-friendly technology. Because of international trade, it is possible to spread that technology, to spread the new knowledge, the know-how on how to protect climate. So there is also this channel that connects international trade to carbon emissions. Furthermore, there is the so-called composition effect. The composition effect regards both the consumption pattern and also the production pattern of an economy, because with international trade we have a very we have an increasing number of goods that we can consume, and with the possibility to trade with other countries, we get access to other products, and this change our consumption structure. On the other hand side, it changes also the production pattern, because the different countries or different enterprises specialize on different products, and it is possible to have both a positive or a negative effect on CO2 emissions over this channel, because the production and consumption pattern can change more in a way that the production of the goods worldwide gets more CO2 intensive or less CO2 intensive. So it is important, especially for this channel, to set the appropriate policy framework in order to make especially the specialization of the different countries more CO2 friendly, in order to have a positive impact of international trade on CO2 emissions. And of course, there is the last point, the so-called efficiency gains channel that connects both sides, and this efficiency gains channel means actually that with international trade, the countries participating in trade have the opportunity to increase their efficiency, and with increasing economic efficiency, they increase also CO2 efficiency. So there it is a very complex connection or relationship between international trade and CO2 emissions, and it is not really possible to capture all these effects in a study or in a research work. It is a complex relationship, and it affords also complex responses on the policy side. And this is what we see on the next slide, where there is a list of different approaches that can be used to tackle climate-related issues by means of or by measures of trade policy. First of all, you can remove trade barriers or trade restrictions on environmental and climate-friendly goods. For example, as is the goal of the negotiations on a global agreement, the environmental goods agreement within the WTO. But you can also use other instruments, for example, constraining fuel subsidies, and instead thinking more of non-discriminating subsidies on renewable energy sources. The sustainable development chapters included in several free trade agreements in the recent years. Also green procurement or selection criteria for procurement based on green ideas or climate related issues, and also the labeling of products that can be harmonized internationally. So when I buy a product abroad, for example, I live in Germany, and when I buy a product in Brazil, to be sure that I buy that same quality in the sense of climate-friendly technology or production. So there are many different approaches, and one of them is also the so-called border adjustment mechanism that has been considered by the European Union recently, and also in Canada, because of the different frameworks and the different policy measures introduced in different countries to capture or to tackle the climate issue. The producers in those countries, in the European Union and in Canada, have to cope with high costs of for their CO2 emissions, and this is why those countries consider some kind of level playing field by introducing measures at the border to make competition fair again. So there is a wide range of different measures that can be used in the field of trade policy to make trade policy and trade more climate friendly. And beyond climate related issues, sustainability is much more of it. It is also about labor standards, about human rights, and so on. So we can also spend a few words on this issue because it is in the center of a broad discussion at the moment, how to pursue better sustainability along the value chain. And for example, we have this discussion in Germany, we have this discussion also in the EU, because several examples have shown several examples shown in the last years that it is possible to increase sustainability or to tackle risks of situations where foreign producers do not bring their own standards from their own country to, for example, developing countries, and it is there have been a few cases where accidents or similar events have led to very adverse developments. So at the European level and also in Germany, the policymakers want to be sure that supply chains, international supply chains, are more sustainable. When creating or when introducing such a legislation, they have to think also on the about the positive effects of those supply chains, and they are listed on the next slide, where we can think of international investors being the ones who create jobs, who help the countries develop, who help or support international trade and also growth, who are the developers of technology and also standard setter. But it is also important to increase incentives for them to bring more sustainability from their home countries. And this is why in the European Union and also in Germany, there is the approach of introducing some kind of a supply chain law or due diligence. However, it should be designed in a way that it does not eliminate all those positive effects, but targets or is focused on the eliminating of the negative aspects of international trade, and this is important to be considered in the policy making. I think I will stop here and give the chance to my colleagues to say also a few words on these issues, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Galina, for this really interesting introduction. Just before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to remind you that you can ask questions and give comments through the Mentimeter link, and I think Andrew just posted it again. So you can either use the link or you can use the QR code, which you actually see now on the current slide. So I'd like to continue with our second speaker. Ruby Lambert is our second speaker, and she's a sustainability expert at UNCTAD at the Secretariat of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards. She's going to talk about leveraging the role of market-based tools such as voluntary sustainability standards to foster sustainable food value chains, and in particular, how that can happen post-COVID. The floor is yours, Ruby. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and also thank you very much, Galina, for the comprehensive presentation on the environment aspect of the sustainability. I will now turn the focus on the social aspect, especially relevant when mainstreaming certifications, standards, eco-labeling demands. Hello, everyone. My name is Ruby, Program Management at UNCTAD and Secretariat at the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, UNFSS. My discussion today is mainly referenced on, oh, can you change the slide, please? I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. My discussion today is mainly referenced on these two papers we recently published. Therefore, if you would like to delve deeper in the subject, I invite you to download these papers via the UNCTAD website. Next slide, please. Very briefly, I will touch on the role of voluntary sustainability standards in value chains and its impact from COVID and looking to build back better through sustainable value chains. Next slide, please. In a nutshell, VSS are standards that specifies requirements that producers, traders, manufacturers, retailers, or service providers may be asked to meet relating to a wide range of sustainability metrics. This includes human rights, workers' health and safety, etc. What is more important is what VSS contribute from a market demand perspective, such as a seal of approval, an effective marketing tool. Retailers can demand premium price as the product stands out, especially now that consumers are becoming well aware of the supply chain issues, as well as market access, especially true for developing countries export to the developed markets. Next slide, please. Today, there are over 400 VSS available in the market. Next slide. And intensified, especially in open economies with diversified economic sectors and exports. The top 5 countries we identified are Brazil, US, China, India, and Indonesia, which is not surprising, right? Next slide, please. And we also found that agriculture is the sector that covers a wide range of VSS scope. Next slide. So very briefly, VSS work as a market-based instrument, typically regulated by information and voluntary by nature. But today, VSS have become a de facto market entry condition for exports, for example, through free trade agreements. And today, there are 19 FTAs we found that refer to VSS as import conditions, especially, you'll see this is especially in the EU, the US and Canada. Next slide, please. Although VSS are recognized as an optimistic view towards sustainable development, there are challenges as well. Typically understanding what is meant by credible standards, since there are so many of them out there. Compliance are rather costly, meaning that there are tendencies that small-scale producers may face the risk of marginalization. And the fact that standards are not always harmonized, it causes unnecessary multiplication. Next slide, please. Thus, here I've laid out some pointers that VSS may be barriers to trade, but also enhances the global trade. The barriers, as I have shared earlier, constitute hefty upfront costs for certification, not just certification, but also the changing production techniques and downtime, which will affect especially small producers and farmers and SMEs in developing countries. There are also the net effect of trade costs, which reduces the competitive advantages, and mainstreaming VSS may marginalize small-scale producers in developing countries who are already confronted with information and capacity gap. But there are also a great deal of opportunities. To think about it, certification can expand market access. VSS may improve the financial and market share gains which should improve the workers' and producers' wages, as it also aims to protect the environment and promote overall economic growth. The thing to note here is that in order to measure the effectiveness of VSS as a tool to meet the sustainable development goals, the uptake of VSS has to be mainstreamed and spread across geographical landscape. Last but not least, considering the dynamics of supply and demand, is that the demand for sustainable products keep rising. There will be a shift towards greater sustainability market across countries. Next slide, please. Now, I will come to some of the findings we gathered in our research about agri-food supply chains in developing countries. We found that at least 1/3 of the world's export in agri-foods come from developing countries. The integration of developing countries in agro-based value chain in 2019 account for 28%. This is excluding China, and that China alone account for 7% of the world's export of agri-food. This means that there is a big economic value for these countries to integrate in the agri-food supply chains. In value terms, this is approximately $310 million of revenue in 2019. Next slide, please. Okay, so this leads me to my next point, which is the share of employment in agriculture and in developing countries. Data from the ILO has estimated that 1.1 billion people are engaged in agriculture, between waged workers and small family-owned farmers. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, 57%, more than half of the active population are engaged in agriculture, 62% of female and 56% of male employed in this sector. Now, looking at this diagram on the right, I will tell you two stories. The first story is developing countries have a higher tendency of depending on agriculture as a contribution to their GDP. For example, Sierra Leone depends on agriculture to contribute more than half of their GDP. Even though these countries are the main contributors of agriculture and the food we eat, the wages of the workers often place them on the bottom rung of the rural poverty, even below subsistence level. The last point I wanted to raise here is that these countries, although they produce agriculture, they still have to import food. 11 countries in the Caribbean, for example, import more than 50% of their food needs. So trade is has a huge impact on food and nutritional security as well for these developing countries. Next slide, please. Very quickly, I will just highlight some of the key points on how COVID-19 impact food value chains and, more importantly, the food producers in developing countries. Some of this you are already aware of, and what I did was I classified them in terms of supply chain analysis and demand side supply side analysis and demand side analysis. Now, under the supply side analysis, we do know that logistical disruptions often affect food producers when it comes to their income stability. This affects their food security as well. Logistic disruptions also contribute to waste, which affects the environment. And these gases, known as methane, contributes to the greenhouse gas, which comes back to its effect on human health as well. So during the COVID lockdown, there has been some protectionist direction as well that some countries stepped on export and import restrictions. Export ban typically to curb the risk of shortages in the domestic market, and import restrictions due to mainly sanitary and phytosanitary reasons. Farmers typically face farming input implications such as seeds and fertilizers, etc. And most importantly, lockdown measures also affect labor shortages, which ultimately affects productivity, income, and food security. Next slide, please. On the demand side analysis, there are concerns on the availability, especially in low-income countries that also depend on food imports. These food producers and their families are severely impacted by the food crisis. through some papers, we also found that when income is severely low, families tend to push their children to assist in their agricultural activities, therefore diminishing their attendance for education. We also found that there seems to be heavier pressure on food standards, which I will come to very heavily afterwards. Given the heavier import restrictions, most countries try to liberalize these very restrictive measures by adopting certification requirements in order to keep facilitating global trade. There has also been an upward pressure on food prices, which ultimately signal the existence of imbalanced supply and demand. Next slide, please. Therefore, my intervention for this webinar is looking at the integration of voluntary sustainability standards, VSS, in food value chains. Why? Because VSS is a market-based tool that could potentially foster sustainable consumption and production. So we see it this way: while consumers demand for sustainably produced food, producers supply sustainably produced food. May sound very simple, but the complexities highlight that there is a role for governmental intervention to facilitate this. Next slide, please. So I am coming to the end here, so I'll just wrap up very quickly on fostering sustainable production and consumption. Firstly is the alignment of national goals to the SDGs. Mainstreaming VSS, as we know, is not as easy as it seems, as I have highlighted earlier, some of the externalities. Although VSS can create more resilient supply chains by emphasizing improvements through its monitoring and transparency mechanisms, the need for multi-stakeholder approaches led by national mandates can help to curb the barriers it poses in international trade. Farmers also need social protection in agricultural settings. As a market response mechanism, fair trade, for example, leverage price premiums for community development programs. Next slide, please. And the key for producer countries is to enhance its competitiveness in their agri-food supply chains. This is through incentivizing the uptake of VSS. I'm almost done here. And most importantly, the need to develop local sustainability capacity building programs. The thing is that obtaining information about sustainability adjustments is not always clear-cut, and it takes time and effort for these producers. So time and effort for them also translates to money value. So it is important to ensure they get this adequate information easily. And we also see that there is a need to align the global governance of VSS, especially by bridging the gaps between supplier and producer countries, and also between producer and producer countries. Next slide, please. So here is the end of my presentation. Everyone is welcome to follow the unfss.org. .org. All information and dialogue attendance are accessible for free. In fact, we have an upcoming dialogue on sustainability standards and social concerns this coming 4th of May, as we discuss the design and effectiveness of sustainability standards to address social concerns. So I thank you again for your time, and I shall leave my contact information here for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruby, for this really interesting intervention. I'm just going to move on straight away so that we have some time to discuss some of the aspects later on. So again, reminding you of the Mentimeter link, because we're very interested to get as many questions as possible from you. So now I'd like to continue with our third speaker. So we've seen the broad role that a tool like voluntary sustainable standards can play in global value chains. So now we want to look a bit more specifically at work being done to concretely increase the implementation of such standards. For this, our third speaker, Mathieu Lamol, is going to present this. He's a senior advisor on sustainability standards and global value chains at the International Trade Center. So he's going to discuss the standards map developed by the International Trade Center and how this innovative online tool can increase transparency all along global value chains to push for more sustainable trade. The floor is yours, Mathieu.
Thank you very much, Adriana, Andrew, for the invitation, and all the speakers for their insights on the topic. It is clear that we are at a very interesting time right now with the COVID and hopefully post-COVID emergence and building back better, or some would say building forward better. Sustainability is at the core of what we are thinking at the ITC and in all or organizations, in terms of ensuring that the trade would bring some additional positive aspects to the emergence after the pandemic. So I'm very pleased to be on the panel. Thanks for the invite. So as you said, Adriana, I represent the International Trade Center, which is a sister organization to UNCTAD and Ruby, who was presenting just before me. So it's great to have you, Ruby, on at the table. ITC, it's an agency that is mostly dedicated to helping small and medium-sized enterprises to develop and to access international markets, but doing it in a way that respects social issues, human rights, workers' rights, all the ILO conventions, and also with a good consideration to environment perspectives, quality management, and ethics. So at the ITC, we have built a standards map tool, which is a global public tool everyone can use. So everyone today at this conference can certainly go back home with this into their pocket, a standards map. And I will take the next few minutes in explaining where it's coming from and how it can really help policymakers trickle down also information back to the companies, and companies understand better how the markets and the global value chains are playing a role for them. So with the next slide, I would like to just say, just echoing a little bit what was said before in terms of this proliferation of standards and tools, demonstrating certainly that there is more and more emphasis on sustainability. If you wish, the first graphic represents this big wave of standards being developed shortly after this Rio summit in 1992. So really a kind of an awakeness of the society that we cannot consume and trade and waste things as before. We need to think of it in a sustainable development perspective, and that has actually implicated the creation of numerous initiatives, standards, certifications, and programs that would focus on, if not all of the elements, at least some of the elements of sustainability. So this is really kind of looking at the history. And obviously, after a proliferation, there is more or less like a plateau that started in the years 2015 to 2020, more or less. So still new standards are being developed, but there is a lot more consolidation rather than there was a proliferation in the years 1995 until 2000 and 2005. Now, in terms of volumes of products that are certified, again, you would still have some policymakers or trade analysts looking at sustainability as a niche market, and a niche where not so much is going on. But the second graph you see on the graph is actually showing the opposite, that really sustainability is going from niche to mainstream. So that a lot more products are being certified, a lot more hectares are actually considered in certification schemes. And this is really something that cannot be avoided or not considered anymore. This is part of the new reality. And of course, all of this was just before COVID hit us, and in the sense of building back a new world, a world that actually would be more resilient, then sustainability has a key role to play. So with that, I would like to go to the next slide and also look at what the importing markets are looking at. And this is a study that was conducted by the ITC, also looking at sustainability, but not so much from an exports perspective, but looking at the retailers and the shops and the consumers here in Europe, because that's the case study that we worked on. So we focused on 5 major markets: France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Spain. And we conducted hundreds of interviews with the largest retailers and supermarkets and brands and manufacturers. And certainly more than 90% have actually reported that there has been an increase in their sales of sustainability products, and that the next 5 years will even have a higher growth of those sustainable products sales. So there is an acceleration of sustainability at all levels, especially also in these big market players that are importing products from the global south. And this is something that can be reflected across the board in all or mostly all of the sectors of the economy. So when we compared the evolution of sales of traditional products versus sustainable products, there has been a constant rise in showing that very much the sustainability sales are growing very quickly in the European markets. Similar studies would also highlight same trends in the US, in Canada, in Australia, but this enabled us to really dig into the details of the European reality. Now, this is bringing some key questions to us as an agency. How can we help the global value chains actors in making sense of these standards and sustainability requirements? So the next slide will actually highlight the status of mind of the ITC, bearing in mind, one, that there is if not anymore a proliferation, still there is a big basket of sustainability standards. Some are very credible initiatives, impactful initiatives. Others could be more like marketing or greenwashing ones. And the question is, it's the same for a consumer that goes to buy a chocolate bar in the supermarket and sees all the logos on the chocolate bar, or a policymaker that tries to influence policies and trade agreements. It's about which one to choose. And if not one to choose, what are aspects or elements that would help understand the differences or the complementarities between all these different standards? So here at the ITC, we have built a global repository, and we have built it directly with the standards organizations. So we have today more than 300 sustainability standards, eco-labels, code of conduct, audit protocols that have worked and are continuously working with us to maintain and update their information in this global repository, the Standards Map. And within that repository, we can look at how SMEs can really make the most of sustainability standards to, number one, learn on sustainability issues. Number two, comply with the requirements, understand a roadmap for improvement, and therefore accessing new markets and positioning their products. And then three, to also help policymakers understand how their national or regional regulations align with existing tools, so that there is no, repetition and reinventing the wheel all again. Sustainability has been discussed at length over the last 30 years, and there are very good discussions, very good tools that exist. And so policymakers also can benefit from a standards map perspective in seeking for pushing the private sector into the right direction. So this is basically the main purpose of Standards Map, helping you as company, as consumer, as NGO, academic partner, or as a policymaker to compare and contrast sustainability initiatives. The next slide is actually just before diving into the tool itself, just giving you the website address. So it is very easy, standardsmap.org. And within that, again, highlighting the key features, we have more than 300 sustainability standards that you can put side by side and analyze in great level of detail. There are more than 80 sectors that are covered, 192 countries that are represented as standards where certification or compliance could take place, or as markets that can purchase and buy the certified products. Our user stats has grown quite a lot between the last 10 years, with an acceleration over the last 5 years, also due to the fact that we cover more and more sectors, more and more countries, more and more standards. One thing which is not on the slide is the scope of the database. When we say we compare standards, we have a backend database of about 1,600 data points. So 1,600 data points where you can really look in a very granular way on how standards are, let's say, addressing climate change, water diversity, workers' rights, child labor, discriminatory regulations, etc. So there is really a big spectrum of information that is available from the standards map. Now, the next slide is giving you an example on how it works. Again, in a as user-friendly way as possible. Once you enter the tool, you have simple filters to confirm. So which is the sector or the product? Is it banana? Is it cocoa? Is it textiles, garment? Is it about financial services? Anyway, you select a sector or a product. You select a country of origin if you want. I mean, it's not necessary. I mean, you can select only one sector filter or 2 or 3 or 4, like the country of origin, let's say coffee in Brazil, or it could be anything else. And then the destination market, like, okay, if you're looking specifically at exports to Canada or to France or Germany, then you would select it. And as soon as you put a new filter, then the list of standards is going down. Okay, so this is a very simple trickle down. The more filters you put, the less standards you have that correspond to all your filters at the same time. So here you have a list, and then once you want to start looking at standards side by side or comparing or analyzing them, you see there is a green tick. You just select the relevant standard, like in this case, BioSwiss or Fair Trade. You can also search by name. Would you like to search for Cargill standard on responsible soy, or Unilever or Rainforest Alliance? I mean, of course, you can select any standard you want. The thing is that the graphics that go in the next page of the standards map, they allow maximum 4 standards or codes at the same time. So you see, when you have them side by side, you have a representation of the coverage and the main intensive chapters of the standard. It is by no means a beauty contest where one standard that has the highest bar is the best standard. Not at all. This is a common misunderstanding of the standards map. It's more saying, okay, the standards cover mostly social issues or environmental issues, or let's say quality or ethics, but it is not a value judgment. It is a mapping of standards. And the next slide will show you why this is so much of a mapping, because here on the top left, you have the table that shows Fair Trade, and then BioSwiss, Unilever, Rainforest Alliance. You can see that some of these cover issues, in this case related to soy, sometimes within a continuous development perspective, like you have certain targets per year or 3 years or 5 years. Sometimes it is very mandatory or optional recommendation. So the mapping exercise here will tell you what is covered, what is not covered, and then how is it covered as a short-term perspective, as a mandatory, or sometimes also as a recommendation. And this is only by reading those details that you will see the differences between the standards. In addition to looking at the standards, let's say requirements, there is the whole market aspect as well, where you see the market trends, looking and zooming into certain regions or sectors, looking at bar charts that show you the average and the amount of certificates or the hectares of certification. So in conclusion, the standards map that has been developed here by ITC, well, it is a global public tool, mostly used by small and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries, but certainly at the disposal of everyone, including the large buyers and retailers that are looking for options in their responsible sourcing strategies. It is also available to the policymakers looking to assess and align regulations or regulatory frameworks with private standards and other international frameworks, such as ILO conventions, OECD guidelines. They are also in the standards map. And then the whole thing is very much looking at how trade and sustainability considerations can help SMEs in meeting the new challenges of global trade. And I think in the context of post-COVID, there will be an even higher need for those considerations of sustainability as they reinforce resilience of companies and capacity to handle the challenges ahead of us. So I think I will stop here, Adriana, and give you back the floor. Thanks again for the invite, and happy to take questions in the session a little bit later. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Mathieu, for this really interesting intervention and this interesting tool. I'm going to move on straight away to our fourth speaker, who is Miguel Gamboa, and he's the Latin American Supply Chain Services Manager at UTZ, a certified, which is part of the Rainforest Alliance. So he's going to present some of the work that Rainforest Alliance is involved in concerning trade and value chains, and some of the tools and strategies which they use on the ground to improve sustainable outcomes environmentally, socially, and economically. Because we're running a bit late, I'd ask you to stick maybe to the 10 to 12 minutes with your presentation so that we have some more discussion. So go ahead, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Adriana, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invite. I will just pass through several of the slides because some of the issues have already been covered by my colleagues. So then we are coming now from merging from two certification programs, and we did it because we saw the value added to reduce the cost for the members, for the producers mainly, and also to make a stronger program. So who we are now a new program that has been created to support communities and producers in order to have better income and have a better life. So now we are working strategically into 4 interventions. 2 of them are our current interventions, as you see in the slide. One is based on landscapes and communities, and the other one reimagining certification. Then besides those things, we needed to work together with other sectors, and then we have support intervention like that we call advocacy, which is basically working with governments, other NGOs, and other related interested parties that could be supporting also communities and producers. And the other one is tailored supply chain services, which is basically working together with the market, with the companies, in order to facilitate and to work together with them into their sustainability goals and also into their interests. I will mention a little bit about this in the coming slides. Next, please. So we have just rebranded the company, the organization, and we are also putting more interest into the support, the transparency that we give along the supply chain and the value chains that we work with, and also to create more data information on what is the impact on what we are doing together with the members. Next, please. So this is what I meant about building a strong recognition, because we understand that certification itself is not the result or the answer, sorry, to the sustainability. We are, as we have seen before, we are part of an important tool for that, but not the tool for it. So then we also know that the consumers should understand what the certification and the standards meant, and we made this study also understand what was about it. That is why we become one organization. Next, please. Yes, and then what we want is to keep changing the way how the world produces, sources, and consumes. Is working among the value chains at all. We are working in coffee, cocoa, banana, tea, and more than 100 other products in which we want to make this change. Next, please. Yeah, so then these are data that have already been shared and based on some of the studies that we have. So I won't talk about these because in the previous participations have been mentioned several of these data, but this is the basis of our work as well, in working together with what the consumers want to know or understand, and how are the markets trends coming. So based on that, we also want to understand, and we try to understand also the needs in the origin countries, and we have staff working in all the countries that we have participation. Next, please. Yeah, and of course, we cannot stop talking about what COVID has happened, but we have seen also that during the 2020, the sales and the market share from sustainability products has increased somehow. Next, please. Next slide, please. So how do we do it? Here's where I want to make more emphasis. In terms of landscapes and communities, what we do is try to facilitate collective action and work with the stakeholders to co-create and implement and also monitor the common vision of sustainable development, but based on every sector needs or every landscape needs and context. And also to leverage market forces and socio-political capital to drive sustainable economy activity as well. So that is working under the landscapes and communities umbrella. Next one. But for doing this, we needed to reinvent, let's say, somehow our certification process. And we work together with our partners, and what we want to do is to harness the power of data. We understand that impact information is a key issue also for giving information and also for accessing to other support opportunities. We also have analyzed very in deep where our requirements and how we can work together to the communities and to the producers to get them and to make them done. Adapt to different contexts as well. And also the continuous improvement and the continuous evolving is part of this approach that we have created for this year, new certification standard. And also to drive change at the sector level. Next, please. As I mentioned before, we are supporting also the supply chains and the value chains by working together with the companies and also to support and to give them the chance to work together to facilitate the adoption of the Reimagine certification, but also to support the programmatic and technological innovation to accelerate and scale up certification impact and to intensify focus on sector transformation across the priorities landscapes to deepen impact and bridge the gap between where we are today and where we want to be in 10 years, but also to support their plans or their goals that they could have based on different issues. I can mention, for instance, we just finished a project in Guatemala with a gender approach, which a supermarket from Germany, and also to support a group of women that works in a coffee cooperative in Guatemala, as an example. Next one. And then the advocacy part, we have identified that we need, as I mentioned, work together with other NGOs, to international organizations as well, to strengthen policy frameworks and implementation, to amplify the voices of farmers and producers, and to build a multi-stakeholder consensus and action to ensure all public and private sector actors are doing their part. We have just finished a project in 9 countries around the world, which was called Sector Partnerships, and we strengthening the advocacy capacity of several of our partners in this project to create awareness and to also learn how to approach the local, regional, and national governments to request needs and to make their voice be heard. Next one. And what about value chains? We are also trying to give this evidence as we work in Latin America and well, we work in all the regions, but try to identify this information that give us the chance to go for more support together with other companies and markets to have higher yields and profits. We have learned from this implementation of our programs that producers can also receive higher prices, have higher environmental quality, and also to improve their qualities and reduce their costs. Next one, please. We are in bananas as well, working in the main countries that produce bananas. We also have data and information about the impact of our certification. I will go a little bit more faster on these ones in order to comply with the timing, because these are basically the results of our studies that we have made. Can you go to the next one? please. And we are talking not only about the production and not only about the trading, but also about the livelihoods on the countries and communities that we work together. Next one. About human rights as well. With these studies, we found out that through the certification, through the training programs, we are getting and supporting that the producers could have a healthier and safetier and better living conditions, but also improve the attendance of children to school and to increase awareness of women's rights and participation of women in decision making, but also to the new generations as well. Next one. We are working on more smart climate tools to support the efforts on improve our climate change impact, but also to improve and to reduce deforestation and to improve the results on the environmental part. Next one. This is related to forest and biodiversity, but I want to go to the next one because I want to make also a strong emphasis on what we have seen on how the trade deals impact this. And I have called it the pull action. When we started all these certification initiatives, we identified that when the trade, meaning the traders, companies, supermarkets, etc., make deals with the supply and the value chain, and they ask for these initiatives, then there is an acceleration on adopting better practices. And the answer from the supply chain and producers is faster. And even better if the deals are related to better prices, for sure. This the answer time is, and also the quality of the answer is bigger than when it is only an initiative from the producers, which it doesn't mean that they don't have this better and better time response, etc. But when the whole value chain is integrated, these results are coming faster and in a better way. But also we have the other side. When there are traders and supermarkets, etc., that are not very deep interested into this and they just want it, as some other colleagues mentioned, as a fake washing or greenwashing, then we started seeing some claims from the producers saying that they are not having the best results because the trade are asking for some kind of combos in which they ask for certified and non-certified products, but given a standard price, and then the differentiation of the effort that they have done through the certification is lost somehow. And this, of course, reduces the motivation of supply chains, but also reduces the motivation to complying with the certification request. And this also makes us to be interested into strengthening the assurance on this. We want that what is said, what is mentioned in the package is also or in reality what is happening in the practices. Next one. And here I just show you some examples of how we support the supply chain, but also the companies on their efforts to communicate about this, which is important to create awareness on their consumptions. We have campaigns like the Follow the Fraud, in which we support the companies to communicate about these things. I will just stop here and looking forward to the questions. And thank you very much again for the invitation to explain about what we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for this really interesting and timely presentation that allows us now to get into the discussion. So maybe the panelists can turn on their cameras so that we can see who's discussing with us. That would be great. I've looked at the questions in the Mentimeter, and well, we've got a wide range of questions, but I'd like to start with one from the beginning. And one question that was raised, and maybe Ruby wants to start on that, is how can we actually overcome the problem of such voluntary standards to be a barrier of trade you mentioned in your slides? Can you elaborate on this, please?
Thank you for the question. Well, In order to look at VS as a more positive approach to trade, more often than not, these issues are mostly faced by developing countries. And what we do at the UNFSS, part of our mandate, is also to provide support for national platforms and national initiatives in order to provide capacity building programs, information for these countries to reap the benefits of sustainability standards as a market-based tool. So these platforms that we work directly with, basically what they do is they provide a neutral forum to exchange information and learn about voluntary sustainability standards. They do collect and exchange information on national standards and also assess the needs of decision makers and other stakeholders. So what we do also is try to link the national demands with international expertise. So through these multi-stakeholder platforms, the dialogues international, we look at the dialogue from a producer, from a developing country sort of exchange, but more so from the South-South exchange as well. So it's in a way building an institution in order to strengthen the understanding of voluntary sustainability standards, because obtaining this information itself takes a lot of time and energy for these producers in developing countries. So we think that there is the need to provide that at the beginning.
Okay, thank you. This sounds really interesting. There's one question that was liked by 6 people, which is how can voluntary sustainability standards be integrated into trade policy? Maybe Galina, would you want to elaborate on this? How we can use what Ruby has introduced with a voluntary standards approach? What implications would it have on trade policy?
Yeah, thank you for this excellent question. And I would like to add just a few points to what Ruby already said, because building capacity is a very important starting point. When we consider trade policy is on setting the framework for trade, and with trade policy measures we can increase barriers or lower barriers to trade, and we can try to consider the sustainability of products, not the products themselves, but the sustainability part of that product that can be sold, as we already saw in the different presentations. We can consider the sustainability of the products as the product that we actually want to trade. And we currently have very high barriers to trade, non-tariff barriers to trade, as considering the BSS jungle, as Matthew put it. I found this very illustrative of the severity of the problem that we have if we try to trade internationally sustainable products, because we have to cope with this different, or we have to cope with them, but we can also utilize them, all those different standards, different signs, and so on. So I think trade policy is not only on developing trade agreements or global multilateral approaches, but also on the forum to discuss those issues. How can we harmonize such signs, such approaches to enable the international trade of sustainability of products? So I think exactly the point of labeling and harmonizing labeling standards can be very helpful in this regard.
Okay, thank you. There's another question which was raised by one person and was liked a lot. How to distinguish between greenwashing and standards and good sustainable standards through the standard mapping tool. Mathieu, what would be your answer on this?
Thanks for the question. There is no easy answer to it, because obviously there are multiple ways to look and analyze sustainability standards, but we believe that through the the 1600 criteria, there is enough for one to make a judgment on the robustness and the credibility of the standard. On our side, there are a few key principles that we recommend everyone to take when it's about judging the credibility and the non-greenwashing system of standards, which would be to always look both at the content of the standard and the way the standard operates. Okay, so there are content requirements and the level of which the standards are really putting together compliance requirements that have a step-by-step continuous improvement processes, and that they are comprehensive enough and clear enough. So not such kind of a very vague criteria like try to remove the wastewater and not drain it directly to the river. This is vague, but you have standards that are more critically precise, like try to analyze the level of pesticide residues or contaminants in the wastewater and do it this way or that way. So there is a credibility aspect in the way the standard has expressed the requirements, and then there is a credibility aspect on the way the standard is verifying that the compliance is clear, that this is not just a click the box exercise, and this is the assurance processes with trained auditors, or at least with capacity building program on the ground, with a continuous and a certain frequency of assessments and verification. So in the standards map, you can actually review all of these parts together. And we strongly recommend to take always a helicopter view and look both at what is in the content of the standard and how the standard operates, and not just look at how brilliant it may look like on the paper, like the perfect standard, but in practice it may fail if you have a verification assessment only every 10 years. Yes, so this is just an exaggeration, but to explain that you need to take into consideration all of this in order to come to a fair judgment.
Just to add one question that was raised as well, which might be linking to it. So how can voluntary sustainability standards be added to the ITC standards maps?
So in this case, it's very simple. We just have a team here that is happy to work on any new standard. The only condition is that the standard does exist, that there are a number of sustainability requirements. Doesn't need to cover everything, even if it's just focusing on one aspect of sustainability, one aspect of social, or one aspect of environment, it's enough. But we need to have at least an established, published standard together with an operational system, so certain rules of engagement for the members, or verification and assurance. Once the standard is operational and exists, then just contact ITC and we'll be happy to work on referencing the standard.
Thank you. So I'll just switch to Miguel now, because there was a question specifically raised for him. So the Rainforest Alliance has been engaged in sustainable value chains for more than 2 decades. What, if any, key changes or accelerating trends have you seen in the last 2 to 3 years?
Thank you. I think there is an increasing of the interest into not collaborate, but to comply with sustainability when the trade gets involved. I mean, when all the value chain is involved, and we have also seen the interest of the companies to support these initiatives and the efforts that the producers are doing into increasing their sustainability practices as well. I also have seen that there is an initiative of other sectors to improve these practices as well. I will mention things related with the waste management. I'm coming back basically from the coffee sector, and 15 years ago, the water waste treatment practically didn't exist. Now there are different approaches and practices that are supporting this kind of practice as an example in that sense. So I would say that the environment and social issues have changed. There is a lot of things to improve, of course, because we haven't get there yet. But these are some of the examples that I can mention in that sense.
Yeah, and one further question. there have been a couple of comments or questions on how can we avoid that such standards only increase the costs at small producer level, or where is the, how can we avoid the burden is the compliance burden remains at the small producer level? There have been 3 or 4 questions on this. I don't know who of you wants to answer this, but I think it's a question that has been raised several times.
Adriana, may I just give some input to this? We have just finalized a study with our members of the cost of audit, for instance. And I just want to mention that it was said before that one thing is the implementation cost and the other thing is the audit cost. And in the sense of the audit cost, we have got reports from the members, and somehow, more or less, the costs are between 0.01 cent, 1 to 2 cents per pound in coffee, and for the auditing cost. So then the major of the cost is the implementation of the practices. But if we connect this implementation of practices to the improvements that they could have in terms of yields, in terms of reducing costs, and in terms of improving and having a higher price, and also to assure at least a medium-term agreement with their buyers, it could be, instead of making the emphasis on the cost, that is what we are trying to identify the benefits that they are getting to by implementing these things. And if we talk about, we are only talking about the costs that you could cover, but there are other costs like the social costs and the environmental costs that they could be spending if they don't comply. This is something that we are going to improve in the coming years to measure in this sense.
Okay, so thank you for this, because that's the practical side. What does it mean at the end of the day? But if we go back a bit more on a meta level, what role do governments have in promoting and facilitating such voluntary sustainability standards? How are we going to get more sustainability into value chains? Ruby, do you want to answer to this, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm very happy to answer this. Yeah, so definitely government have a role to play, not only demanding it. For example, you can integrate it in trade policies. A clear example to this is, for example, the EU Renewable Energy Directive do have direct references to VSS. For example, the reference to Roundtable Sustainable Roundtable on Responsible Soy is an example. So this is one way. There's also the integration in public policies, or more so procurement, sustainable procurement. I think this is quite big in Germany. I think your examples would be very interesting because the demand there is of high volume, really large volume. So if you integrate sustainability standards, it's part of the procurement process that would have increased the uptake of sustainability standards as well. Do you want to repeat the question again and to see if I really answer everything?
I think you answered basically,
okay.
Because it was just, well, how can governments, engage to get it more, get sustainability more into global value chains? But maybe Mathieu wants to continue to answer, what does it mean for businesses? How can they become more sustainable, and what can basically policy do to encourage this?
I think there were a few questions in the Mentimeter about benchmarking, and I would like to use that as a way to answer as well on how the policy and the businesses can do it, because there is a multitude of sustainability tools that exist, and the key question is how to make it efficient in global value chains. So on the government side, I mean, benchmarking standards and regulatory frameworks is very much helping to understand what is already there, and not asking private sector to make additional claims, additional verifications if they are already using credible and acceptable standards. I mean, acceptable in the eye of the government, and that means benchmarking and recognition that the governments and the policymakers have certain targets and goals, and some of the standards that exist on the market, they are answering those requests, or at least partly, and the benchmarking can help identify that. So I would say the governments, they can build on those tools even if they are developed in the private sector, like private standards, because if they build a good methodology for benchmarking, that helps. Germany is a good example in doing benchmarking in a multitude of sectors, mostly textiles and garment, but also soon in agri-food. And I think this is an example. The due diligence in Europe is also going forward in looking at social and human rights aspects of private standards compared to the EU regulations. And then to answer the part of the private sector, they also use benchmarking, because if you take a big company like Unilever, Nestle, Danone, they have a multitude of suppliers, sometimes of products coming from Southeast Asia or Africa, South America, and all of these suppliers, they have different certificates. And in the end, they all want to be accepted by the big multinational Danone, Nestle, or others. And therefore, they need also to benchmark the South American standards with the African standards or Southeast Asia standards, or standards that apply in those regions and sectors, so that the company, let's say Nestle, they have their standards, Unilever, they have their standards, but rather than duplicating all the audits and certification, if they can accept that their standard is close enough to what the supplier has, then they can accept, and then the efficiency of rolling out sustainability is ensured. So benchmarking and looking across different tools is going to be an important solution in the next few years to really mainstream sustainability at all levels of global value chains. At least this is what we strongly believe at the ITC. But benchmarking is not easy. It's like the question you had about standards mapping and how do you compare greenwashing and non-greenwashing. It requires to pick up the right indicators to see first, are the sustainability aspects that we care as a government, as a company, are they covered by the standard? Yes or no? But then is this surely covered and credible enough in the assurance and verification on the ground? And this is the second aspect every benchmark needs to compare as well.
Well, thank you for picking up on the benchmarking issue. That was basically the next question I wanted to ask, but that's perfect to combine everything. I've got one question which I'd like to ask towards the end of the session now, because it's kind of interesting to look at it in this way. So while trade encourages specialization in terms of agriculture, this is often harmful in promoting monocropping and reducing crop rotation and other practices most beneficial to maintaining soil quality and protecting biodiversity. So how can the specialization inherent in agricultural trade be compatible with sustainable food systems? So is this it's quite a provocative question, because it shows up the contradiction, you know, that we, on the one hand side, we have this kind of international division of labor, and then at the same time it doesn't comply with sustainability. So any of you have a thought on this? So this is a difficult question because
yeah, maybe I can just mention something about it, because at the end, specialization can be checked from different aspects, right? And if we talk about sustainability, we also have seen that diversification is part of sustainability, because we have producers that are depending on only one product, and then if there is an environmental issue like a hurricane or something like that, so they have lost if they only depend on one product, right? So I would say that specialization is better on improving and being more professional in their practices, but it doesn't matter if you are producing 1, 2, 3, or whatever, how many products you are producing at your farm. So then this is also part of what we do. We also encourage our members to identify their market opportunities, but also to identify their income diversification as part of their sustainability. So this is something that should also be considered as part of the trading for the producers, that they should depend on only one product, but try to diversify as much as possible to not depend on one thing.
Well, thank you for your answer. Unfortunately, the time is up and there are more questions than answers we can give now at this point. Thank you very much for this. So just to finish up, if I could ask each panelist just to finish a sentence, I'm starting with, well, I'm just going to ask a question. So what potential has trade policy to contribute to curb sustainability? And if you just could give a quick answer to finish up. Miguel, do you want to start, please?
Yes, I think contextualization is one of the words that has to be part of this support from the initiatives on the trade policies as well, and because every single region, every single product have a different aspects and different variables to consider. So that could be one of the things. Is a very hard thing to think about in some seconds, but I will stay with that.
Okay, thank you. And Ruby, you want to come in next?
So on our side, on my side, I think the use of trade policy is a very good intervention per se to actually promote sustainability, in the sense that you can integrate sustainability criteria into trade policies in order to increase the uptake of sustainability standards, as an example. Thank you.
Mathieu, do you want to come in next, please?
Surely. On our side, we see trade policy as a compass. Everyone needs a compass in order to orient themselves. Would you go north or south or east or west? But the compass is there, and the trade policy offers the framework that defines the roadmap components for sustainability. Maybe companies will go rather east or rather south or rather west for some time, but at least trade policy is there to inform on the overall trajectory and directions to take. So it is a very critical component of implementing sustainability in the future.
Thank you. And Galina, last but not least.
Thank you. Well, I have already pointed out that there are many instruments that can be used within trade policy to pursue sustainability, and we have actually written a new policy paper on this issue, and we published it just today, so I can post the link in the chat if you're interested in. I think that the many questions, excellent questions, show how important the issue is, and trade policy is actually the framework that sets the incentives for trading products, and especially for trading sustainable products. So I think that without those incentives, it would be hard to promote sustainability internationally. And we have also this great question on setting standards, social standards by VCCs, VSS, and I think that this can be one of the channels that can promote the development in many developing countries. So I think that trade policy can set the right framework for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much to the four speakers and for all participants joining us from all over the world. So for more information on the work that the One Planet Network is doing on value chains, including a series of consultations on the food, construction and plastic sectors, Andrew has included a link in the chat. So I think there's very insightful discussion, and I hope we're going to continue this, maybe in a different forum, in a smaller forum, and maybe there's a continuation on this topic very soon. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Bye-bye.